Hello everyone, my name is Ether, and today I'll be creating the first iteration of Ormauk's world map. I'll also be tackling a couple ideas that I want to include within the setting. To preface, I am an absolute amateur in world building and especially in writing in general. That's why I have my friends helping me out with this project. These ideas are kind of an amalgamation of things that we talked about and thought it was cool and plausible within the setting. A lot of what I'll be saying are very fluid in their fluid in how canon they are. Things will be changing as I continue this project. Some of the in-universe facts that I'll be saying now might not be true later on. So, with all that preamble covered, let's start with our initial ideas. The starting point for this project was the whole solarpunk movement. Now, I'm not even sure how I came across this term at this point. I'm pretty sure I started out with drawing nature sketches while traveling. I thought it'd be cool to put fantasy creatures in these illustrations, and the more I exposed myself to other artists within that space of like urban sketching and like eco-urban design, the more I saw this like solarpunk word pop up in my algorithms. The whole idea of an environmentally conscious technological movement unfortunately felt fantastical enough from our current world that I wanted to explore it online and any kind of communities around it. What I found was a colorful mixed bag of architectural and sometimes policy-based approach to the solarpunk movement, and not to mention all the art in fantasy and sci-fi stories that I've seen. It was really interesting to see all kinds of perspectives on how to realistically apply loose threads of solarpunk ideals into actionable plans. So, cool. Awesome. But that's only one part of the equation that I wanted to put into Ormauk. The other side I wanted to explore was the fantasy side of things. I was in love with the idea of solarpunk, but I didn't want it to be completely sci-fi. Instead, I pulled the time setting back a bit and thought that urban fantasy would be a bit better fit for what I had in mind. I was playing some of the new Monster Hunter recently and fell in love with the whole game series approach to ecology. I was thinking, oh man, how would this game look like in a modern setting? Nature continues to adapt and is never fully conquered by humans. What would that world look like? Well, would humans learn that it's futile to do so? Would humans destroy themselves trying? And I think that was the whole approach of games like the criminally underrated God Eater games, as well as the Horizon Zero Dawn games, but it wasn't quite what I was looking for. And so that was kind of the real starting point of solidifying the ideas of Ormauk for me. I then started to think, what kind of world would justify having all these loose ideas I had? Initially, I had an idea for a very simple world. Nice little circular planet Ormauk. From there, I start to think what kind of citizens would live there. I know I mentioned urban fantasy, but right now I'm actually sketching some ideas for my iteration of Tolkien fantasy races like elves and dwarves, and playing around with their key features and seeing if I can give them an interesting spin. Anyways, what I had a problem with this planet-sized iteration of Ormauk was how small the setting felt. I kind of wanted travel to still be a problem. But if it's an urban fantasy, i.e. modern fantasy, wouldn't there at least be planes or ships? And that's where a nice little aligning of the stars kind of happened. I was talking with my friend about it, about these loose ideas, and they asked me if I've ever heard of an Alderson disc. I've never heard of this before, friend. Pray tell. Essentially, an Alderson disk is this idea of a megastructure along the same vein as ring worlds or Dyson spheres. It was conceived by a jet propulsion laboratory scientist named Daniel John Alderson. He thought of this disk-like structure built around a central star. The structure would span millions and millions of kilometers with a habitable ring somewhere in the middle of it all. The sun would bob up and down to simulate a day and night cycle, and a wall close to the middle of the disk would prevent the atmosphere from escaping. Now, there's a lot of pretty valid counterpoints as to why this setting wouldn't realistically work. but realism isn't really what I'm going for here. Some discussions online say how easy it is to be thrown off orbit by foreign space objects like asteroids or meteorites. So, we decided to put these concerns aside for now just because of the endless possibilities of ideas that this setting presented. We wanted it more for its absolutely massive scale and the ability to tell a story within a point in time where it's not quite medieval fantasy, but it's not too far into the future kind of sci-fi where its inhabitants have fully conquered the entire world. Plus, a bit of ambiguity towards the full scale of the setting is always nice, especially when dealing with fantasy in general. This kind of ambiguity-led approach to the full breadth of Ormauk also affected how we tackled the question of the disc's creation. We played around the idea of the disc being created by progenitor races or a discarded part of a much larger astronomical machinery, but again, we decided not to fully answer this question for now because I feel like there's some nice story threads that I could answer with an art piece later on. So, there's a lot of unanswered questions here. What did I answer? You might be wondering. Before I answer that, I want to quickly establish the foundational ideas that I nailed down at the beginning of this project to kind of guide me through the design process. I wanted to evoke a feeling of community within this world, a sense of belonging within these pieces. With those things in mind, I started to ask myself, what kind of world would make a sense of community inherent to every inhabitant living in it? I'm trying to avoid naive optimism. So, to continue with the themes of nature, I thought maybe Ormauk's environment, its wilds, could be its own agent, its own character within this world. If nature was able to actively react to its inhabitants, that would make for an interesting dynamic of man versus nature. If, let's say, early in human civilization developed a way to aggressively extract resources from nature, I want nature to retaliate. Who would want to have little parasites extracting stuff from their body? Over time, if a species is unable to adapt to this reactive environment, I assume they just perish, erased from history. But if they're able to coexist with this force, I could see nature letting them do their own business and flourish as much as they want. That's kind of why the solarpunk movement, with the focus on renewable resources, kind of fits into this setting, because nature would just kind of let it slide. For the question as to how Ormauk's environment would accomplish this, I'd like to dedicate a whole video about this. But I'm playing around with some ideas of the dragon race making a wish to awaken the wilds and allowing nature to protect itself. Another thing we kind of settled on are the Spindles. These are the two moons on either side of the disc. The idea behind these is that they are weaving the disc into existence, almost like a 3D printer for an entire world. These are ancient pinnacles of magic and technology working together to create matter out of pure atmospheric magic. It's not known who made these in-universe, but it's also irrelevant to the majority of the disk's inhabitants, since the disk itself is millions and millions of kilometers wide, and most inhabitants will be too busy with their everyday lives to even explore the frigid outer regions of the disk. I'm going to talk more about the Spindles in a separate video, but I kind of had this idea of individuals being able to reach this furthest point of their world and be able to make wishes or rewrite something in the disc to affect the rest of the world, making these Spindles kind of a literal deus ex machina. I don't think I fully captured it in the first iteration of the map, but basically, to give you a perspective, the distance between the sun in the middle to one of the Spindles is the same distance as our real-life sun to about halfway between Mars and Jupiter. I'd imagine it would take many, many centuries to circumnavigate the disk, even with something like a jet. So I imagine most short-lived races will only be able to really explore or travel a small dot of this map. and an average individual of a long-lived ancestry would only be able to cover maybe half of it throughout their lives. This sheer scale of the setting allows me to kind of go crazy with different kinds of civilizations within one world, and that's kind of one of the biggest reasons why I like the idea of the Alderson disc as a setting. Overall, I really like how this one turned out. I didn't want my disc to be perfect in shape, hence the scraggly bits at the end. I also thought that it'd make sense if it had arms extending out like a galaxy would. The use of the medieval sun and moon symbols kind of continues this theme of ambiguity and makes you second guess the accuracy of the map itself. Yes, there is technically an underside that would be equally as massive as this side we're looking at, but that's a whole nother illustration that I'll tackle in the future. For now, this map kind of gives me a nice playground to start putting locations in, start thinking about the kind of people that would be living there, and moving forward with more concepts, basically. Overall, I hope you guys like this illustration. You can subscribe if you'd like to follow this art project, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.